On the 5th of September, 1717, the King of Great Britain published a document that did two things at once. On one page, it offered every pirate in the world a full pardon, free of charge, if he surrendered by a deadline. On another, it listed what the Crown would pay to have him captured instead. £100 for the commander of a pirate ship, £40 for a lieutenant, a master, a boatswain, a carpenter, or a gunner, £30 for any lesser officer, £20 for an ordinary man. The same government, in the same proclamation, was selling the same outcome at two prices. One of them was free. The other started at £20 a head and rose from there, because the bounty was only the first invoice. After the bounty came the ship that carried him in, the men who guarded him, the court that tried him, the witnesses that convicted him, and the apparatus that killed him. This is the cost accounting of turning a pirate into a corpse. It explains why the Crown ran a pardon program and a hanging program simultaneously, and why the cheaper product was the one that ended the Golden Age. To understand the pricing, understand who was actually paying, there was no national police force in this period and no standing budget line for the suppression of piracy. What existed instead was a patchwork of interested parties: merchants losing cargo, colonial assemblies losing trade, governors whose careers depended on quiet coastlines, and a royal navy with more coastline than ships. Enforcement was therefore not a service the state provided, it was a service the state tried to procure from whoever could be induced to supply it. The bounty schedule was the procurement mechanism. By publishing fixed prices per rank, the Crown converted pirate suppression into piecework and opened it to anyone with a ship and an appetite. It also, quietly, priced human beings by their position on an organizational chart, which is a very modern thing to find in a document from 1717. A gunner was worth twice an ordinary hand. A captain was worth 5 of him. The schedule contained one further clause worth noting, because it shows the Crown thinking like a negotiator rather than a policeman. Rewards were also offered to pirates themselves, if they delivered up their own captains. The government was not merely buying capture, it was buying betrayal, at a discount, from inside the target organization. A crew that had signed articles together was now standing in a market where each man had a listed value and each captain had a higher one. But piecework has a well-known weakness. It pays for the capture, not for everything that follows. And what follows a capture is where this business becomes expensive. Begin with the capture itself, and note who financed it. In 1718, the Crown sent Woodes Rogers to take Nassau, the working capital of the pirate world, with 7 ships. Rogers was not given a war chest. He funded the expedition largely himself, with little money and little military support arriving from England, on the strength of a 21-year lease of the islands granted by their proprietors. He succeeded. The pirate republic dissolved, and the campaign, together with his investment in the colony, ruined him financially. The man who ended Nassau spent years afterward in a debtor's prison. The colonial pattern was the same at smaller scale. In South Carolina, the pirate hunting was done by locally raised expeditions. Colonel William Rhett sailed after Stede Bonnet and took him at the Cape Fear River on the 27th of September 1718, after a battle in which men on both sides died. Weeks later, the governor of the colony personally led a second squadron out, killed the pirate Richard Worley in a sea fight, and returned with more than 24 of his crewmen as prisoners. Consider what the colony had just purchased: 2 naval actions, casualties, damaged vessels, and 60-odd men who were now the government's problem, and the government's expense, until such time as they could be lawfully killed. The bounty schedule paid by the head. It said nothing about what a head cost to keep. It is worth pausing on the incentive structure this created for the men doing the hunting. A bounty rewards delivery, not care. It does not fund the guard, the food, the building, or the weeks of legal process between a capture and a lawful death. So the party who captured a pirate had every reason to hand him over quickly, and no reason at all to think about what happened next, while the party who received him inherited a liability with no accompanying payment. In procurement terms, the Crown had written a contract that paid for the input and ignored the process. Every government that has ever outsourced the front of an operation and kept the back of it has discovered the same thing. So examine the storage problem, because South Carolina's arrangements were remarkable. In 1718, the colony had no purpose-built jail. It would not have one until the 1770s. It also had no courtroom. The first proper one arrived in the 1760s. A government about to conduct the largest criminal proceeding in its history possessed neither of the two facilities such a proceeding requires. The solution was outsourcing. Each provost marshal was expected to hold prisoners in his own house or to rent space for them out of his own salary. The marshal, in effect, operated as a private contractor, and the government paid little attention to how he ran the business. The trials themselves were held in a private residence, the house of a shoemaker named Garrett Van Velsen, borrowed for the occasion. Bonnet's crew, 30-odd men, were confined in the town watch house, a single-story masonry building that had never been designed to hold anything like that number. Bonnet himself received different treatment. As an educated man of property and a former militia officer, he was housed under the marshal's own roof with a degree of liberty, on the understanding that gentlemen did not abscond. He absconded. On the 24th of October, Bonnet and his sailing master escaped and fled north by canoe. The recapture took 12 days and another expedition. The sailing master was killed. The most valuable prisoner in the colony had been lost through an economy measure, and the cost of retrieving him fell on the same treasury that had saved money by not building a jail. The lesson is one that any operations manager would recognize. Custody had been treated as an overhead to be minimized, and overheads that are minimized past a certain point stop being overheads and start being risks. Now, the trial itself, which was not one trial, between the 28th of October and the end of November 1718, the South Carolina Court of Vice Admiralty tried 58 men in 13 separate proceedings spread across 5 weeks. The improvised courtroom could not hold everyone at once, so the defendants were divided into groups and processed in batches, which is a scheduling solution familiar to anyone who has run a facility past its capacity. Price the labor involved. 3 weeks passed between the prisoner's arrival and the first trial, spent on legal research, witness interviews, and the drafting of indictments, because the colony knew that London would read the record. A grand jury of 23 men was impaneled, followed by petite juries for each trial. A judge presided. An attorney general prosecuted, with an assistant. Clerks recorded every word by hand, and that transcript was later printed in London as a book. All of this was drawn from a small colony whose fortunes were, by the assessment of the historians who study it, at a very low ebb. Now price the evidence, because this is where the accounting becomes elegant. The prosecution's case depended on testimony from inside the crew. 2 of Benet's men, the boatswain and the sailing master, offered to turn King's evidence in exchange for clemency. The boatswain was never indicted at all and testified for the crown. The state did not buy its witnesses with money. It bought them with pardons, which cost nothing to issue, from the same pardon instrument that had been offered to all of them a year earlier. There was no defense counsel, because in this period no such thing existed for these charges. Every man spoke for himself against a trained attorney general in a shoemaker's front room. The verdicts were what one would expect. Of 58 men tried, 49 were condemned and 9 acquitted. That acquittal rate deserves a moment because it is higher than the arrangement would predict. 9 men walked out of a proceeding with no defense counsel, in front of juries drawn from a town that had recently been blockaded by pirates. Whatever else the Charleston trials were, they were not a formality, and the colony's careful preparation makes sense in that light. The record was being built for readers in London, and a record full of instant convictions would have looked like exactly what a distant government would suspect it of being. The 3 weeks of legal research were, in part, a compliance cost. The colony was not only killing pirates, it was documenting that it had killed them properly. Then the executions, which had costs of their own and purposes beyond the deaths. 22 of Bonnet's crew were hanged at White Point outside Charleston on the 8th of November, 1718. 19 of Worley's men followed weeks later. Bonnet, tried separately after his recapture, was hanged at the same place on the 10th of December. 49 death sentences required 49 hangings and the subsequent disposal of 49 bodies, a logistical exercise conducted by a town of a few thousand people. In London, the same process ran with more ceremony and more overhead. Condemned pirates were held at Marshalsea or at Newgate and carried to execution dock at Wapping. The procession was led by the Admiralty Marshal on horseback, carrying a silver oar as the symbol of the court's authority. The prisoner rode in a cart with the hangman and a chaplain. Every element of that was staffed and paid for. The ritual also generated revenue, though not for the crown. The chaplain of Newgate took the confessions of the condemned and published them, and the sales were his private income. And for the most notorious cases, the state commissioned bespoke ironwork. After William Kidd was hanged in 1701, his body was fitted into a gibbet cage and suspended over the Thames for more than 3 years. That was not punishment, since Kidd was already dead. It was advertising, purchased at public expense, aimed at every sailor entering the port of London. Which reveals what the Crown was actually buying at the end of this process. Not justice, and not even deterrence in the abstract. It was buying a demonstration, and demonstrations are priced by their visibility. A hanged pirate deters nobody who does not hear about it. So the state paid for the procession, the printed transcript, the published confession, and the iron cage. The expensive part of an execution was never the rope. So, total the column as far as it can be totaled. Capture, financed by governors and colonial subscriptions, in one case to the point of personal bankruptcy. Bounty, 20 to 100 pounds per man by published rate. Custody, outsourced to a private household which produced an escape and a second manhunt. Proceedings, 5 weeks, 13 trials, 23 grand jurors, multiple petite juries, a judge, 2 prosecutors, clerks, and printers. Evidence, purchased with pardons. Execution and display, 49 hangings in one colony, and in London, a marshal, a horse, a silver oar, a cart, a chaplain, a hangman, and occasionally a custom iron cage. Against that, the alternative product, offered in the same proclamation as the bounty, surrender, and the account closes at 0. The historical outcome followed the arithmetic. Hundreds of pirates took the pardon, and Nassau, the industry's headquarters, dissolved, not under bombardment, but under paperwork. The trials that followed were reserved for the men who refused the free option, and they were expensive precisely because refusal was expensive to process. Read in that order, the Proclamation of 1717 was not a mercy followed by a crackdown. It was a 2-tier pricing structure, and the crackdown existed mainly to make the free tier attractive. There is one line this episode cannot fill in, and the reason is itself the final entry. South Carolina's government kept meticulous accounts of every penny spent from the public treasury in annual records compiled by its assembly. The journals and the financial accounts for 1718 and 1719 are lost. They have been missing for centuries. So the precise cost of the largest judicial operation the colony ever mounted is and will remain unknown. The pirates of the Golden Age died with their books balanced by a court. The court's own books did not survive.